Okay, welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to be looking at how to use Redshift to make metallic materials from scratch. Now, there are a bunch of Redshift materials that are presets that you can download and work with, but a lot of times those node networks are kind of intimidating, to say the least. And so they're not necessarily super helpful for learning how to make a material. They give you some insight, but there's a lot going on there, and we're going to be focusing on kind of simplifying that down to create really the gold that you see on the on this mask of Tutankhamun. Now, things I want you to note, like we're not making the mask, we're not going to be doing any of the inlay. We're just going to be grabbing a preset head from Cinema 4D's asset browser, and then we will be working on a metal material on that. So we're not going to be doing any modeling in this tutorial whatsoever. But I want you to take a look at this mask and note that, right, it's gold, it's shiny, it's incredibly glossy. However, there are scratches on it, right? There are some smears and smudges in areas where it's not quite uniform in how it looks. The other thing that's good to note is that the lighting makes a huge difference, right? Oops, somehow I'm zooming in the wrong way. Hold on, there we go. All right, so the lighting makes a huge difference. These two images, right, are the exact same mask. This is Tutankhamun. It's death mask. And so, right, you can see lighting also plays a huge role in what gold looks like. Right, all metals, anything that's reflective, they're going to be picking up a lot of color from whatever light source they're involved with. But again, you can see, even though this is a lower quality image in terms of resolution, you can see you get some of the same, this isn't perfectly polished and gorgeous, right? It's almost like it was buried for a couple thousand years and unearthed. And then cleaned. So I just want you to note, as we look through here, one of the things to note is when we work with a material like this is trying to figure out what our base color is and how the different reflections and everything work together. Is there a color tone to the highlights in our reflections? And if you look at this, right, there's some yellow and warm tones. There's a little bit of area here where it's a bit browner. And then there's some areas on the cheeks where it's almost like a greenish cast to it, right? But again, lighting is important, right? So that lighting, if the light that's hitting this, which it looks like this is actually sunlight probably coming in to create this more blue light, and then there's a warmer light up top. Whereas this, right, this is in complete darkness except for whatever light is on there, and it's a pretty warm light that's being used. But we see that there's a lot more yellow in this image than this one. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So you should open Cinema. Again, this is in Redshift. We're going to be using Redshift, kind of building from the tutorials we worked on before. And this is our first introduction to working with nodes. Because in order to get some of those variations and scratches on the surface and smudges and things like that, we're going to need to use nodes to do that. Now, something before we get started is we should save this step one, right? And that's because I have found that Redshift does decide to quit sometimes. And when it quits, it's not even everything's kind of lagging, and then it quits, it just is done, and Cinema just ceases to be open. So fortunately, it usually doesn't crash the entire computer, but it can cause some problems. So let's go ahead and just say File, Save Project, and I'm going to call this Gold Tutorial, because it's gold. I'm going to save that. And the other thing you want to check, if you haven't done this already, is to go to Preferences, which on the Mac is up under, I believe it's under Cinema 4Ds. It might be under Edit if you're on Windows. It's there as well on the Mac. And so if I go to Preferences, I want to go down to, is it files? Yes. You want to make sure autosave is checkmarked and that it's saving about every 5 minutes, and you want to have it saved basically to the same folder that your project's in. This will save you if you're working through a material, you connect a node, and Redshift decides it's the end and it's going away. So, all right, we've got that set. So let's go ahead and you should, if you've been following the tutorial series, you should already have a tab called Redshift or Redshift that allows you to have the Redshift render view in the window. If you haven't done that because you're popping in, you can go down and you can go to the Redshift menu. Now, this menu and stuff doesn't necessarily show up unless you go to your render settings, which I'm just going to go back to standard real quick. If you go to your render settings and you make sure that your renderer is set to Redshift. Once I've done that, I should be able to go to Redshift. I can go to render view, and render view will pop up in a free floating window. And again, if you need, it's kind of annoying when it does this unless you have multiple monitors, and then it's great. But if you don't have multiple monitors, then you can just grab these white marks here, and you can just choose where to attach it to your frame, right? You can put it pretty much anywhere. I'm going to leave it where I have it in Redshift, and so I'm going to put this over here. Okay, so we need to access the asset browser, which is Cinema 4D's or Maxon's basically repository of models and presets. There's like plants and stuff in there. It's awesome. And so if I go down to my window menu and I go down to Asset Browser and I open this up, you'll see there's all sorts of things in here that are available. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to search for head. And it's going to take its sweet time. And you'll see that there is this generic head. So I'm going to take this generic head and I'm going to bring this generic head into Cinema. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to click and drag and drop it into my main view. And you'll note it's pretty small, and that's because it's accurately sized to a human head. Once I have that in there, I'm going to go ahead and hit S so I can zoom on the keyboard so I can zoom in and have this in focus. I am going to close my asset browser at this point. We'll be using some other assets later, but for the time being, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to go ahead and say display garage shading lines to start with. And you'll see, right, this is a reasonably low poly mesh. The first thing I'd like us to do is we're actually going to create 2 copies of these because I want to show some side-by-side stuff. So the easiest way to do that and actually have them be side-by-side is to hold down Control and then click and drag on one of the axes, and you can create a copy. So I've got my 2 heads here because 2 heads are better than 1, and we are almost ready to go. Now I'm going to go over to my Objects tab over here, which, right, because of the way I have this set up, is barely visible. I'm going to drag this over a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and delete the material that is currently on the heads. And to do that, I select the tag, I can hold down Shift, I can select the next tag down too, and I just hit delete. All right, because we're not going to need those materials, and there's a chance that those materials could interfere in some way with the materials that we're applying in a little bit. Okay, so one of the things I said, right, metals, it's really important, if I go to preview, right, the way that these look is all dependent on lighting. And it's not just lighting, right? If you think about a metallic object in the real world, it's reflecting the entire world that's around it, and it's bringing in the colors from that world. And so, right, if I was to put a metallic material on these right now, let's go ahead and do that, and we'll see what happens. I think you probably all know what's going to happen, but so let's go ahead and create some Redshift materials. So we're going to go over here, and remember, right, if you I can't remember what button you use on a mouse, but if you're doing a trackpad, you just 2 fingers slide over. And you can expose this. If nothing else, you can always just drag this over until you can see the thing. We don't really need a huge Redshift window right now. I'm going to open this material manager up, and you'll see that sculpt material is already in there. We don't really need to worry about that, but I'm going to go ahead and select the plus sign to create a new default material. And it's going to take a second to load all the shaders and do all the things. I'm not quite sure why that's taking quite so long today. Well, while I wait for that to update the preview, that's taking forever, I'm going to go ahead and take this metalness of my base property. I'm going to set it to 1. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm a little concerned about what's going on here. I'm going to save this real quick, but I'm going to go ahead and drag this down and drop this on some heads. Okay, so it's working there. For some reason, it is not previewing. I don't know why my computer's running quite so slow this morning, but it seems to be going faster. I still don't know why the preview isn't working here, but whatever. I did just update Redshift, so we'll see if that introduces any problems. Okay, so I've got this metallic, material on here. You'll see the color is pretty dark. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make this much shinier. And so to do that, I will select my material again, and I'm going to go ahead and just make this much wider, which should make it more glossy. And let's see here. I think that should be good. It should be a shiny material. Let's go ahead and hit play or start the start button here in our Redshift render view, right? And you're going to see, we do see our heads, right? There is a default light in the scene, but they, are very, very dark, right? The light is the only thing that's in the scene. It's the only thing reflecting off those surfaces, and everything else is like emptiness, right? This may look like, an emo metal band album cover or something right now, but that's not exactly what we're going for. So what we need to do is we need lights in the scene. And since we're using Redshift and there's things we haven't talked about in the tutorial series yet, what we're going to do is we're going to create the RS Sun and Sky rig. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And you'll see that Redshift does some strange things here, right? I actually really like how it decides to render. This is really great. It shows you what it's doing as it goes. Obviously, this isn't great. So all you have to do to fix this is you just click the refresh IPR button, and it will clean that right up. Okay, so what we're looking at here is we have, if I rotate my view a touch, you can see there's a light here, and that's actually from the sun, right? That's beaming down on these figures. If I rotate my view so the frame updates, right, you can see that we've got a sky. It's blue sky. We're getting a nice, well, evenly lit daytime scene in our object. And the ground plane is actually pretty dark right now. So we're going to lighten that up some because it's pretty dark brown. So I'm going to select the Redshift sky object in my manager over here. I'm going to pull this out so we can kind of see. And you'll see there's a bunch of different settings here. Not too worried about any of them right now. You can increase the intensity. There's different models for the sky. And we can, honestly, let's use the Preetham at all, but you can see each one is going to create like a slightly different outcome. And no, let's just go with the PRG. That's the default. There's turbidity, there's all these other settings. Ground color is the only one I'm concerned with right now. And I just want to make that, I don't know, let's make it like it's grassy. But maybe not that grassy. Let's just give it a little bit of, I don't know. I don't know, maybe we just want more brown in there, right? You can see that this ground color really impacts the way that this image looks. So I'm going to go brownish, but I'm going to do somewhere in this corner down here. So it's a little bit darker, but it's not as dark as it was. Okay, so we've got this set. There's other things we can do and add in here as we go, but this will be good to get us started with our materials. So I don't really need this window up or of any size, so I'm going to go ahead and scroll this up so we have a bit bigger view of what we're working on. And let's go ahead and get started making some of these materials. So now, right, I do have to bring my material manager up and open this material. And I'm going to double click on the material to open this whole material pane. And to start with, I'm going to scoot this over so you can all see. And I'm just going to have one head open. And we're going to be manipulating these base properties before we do any node work whatsoever. So first we have to choose a color that's a good base color for gold. And if we look in both of these images, you're going to see that, right, even in this one, right, there's it's like a warm, like an orange yellow. And even here where there's a lot more blue light hitting the surface, if you kind of look for areas that aren't highlights, right, but are pretty well lit, you get a very similar color here. Now, we can actually use an eyedropper, so I could come over here and grab this eyedropper. Oh, but I haven't set that accessibility up. I don't know if it's going to get angry. Yeah, I have to go give it accessibility. I'm not going to do that right now. So I'm not going to use the color picker, but right, there is like this kind of yellowish, warm yellowish tone, and it's something that is in both of these images. It's always good if you have multiple references images to use them. So I'm going to say base color. I'm going to go somewhere in this orange yellow slider, and I'm going to click up here. And I'm going to say that's probably, if I look at this color here, and I switch back over, I'm pretty close. It could be like maybe a little bit more yellow, just a touch more yellow, and maybe a touch more intense in terms of the vibrance. Yeah, and that gets me to a pretty good base state. Okay, so what are the next settings? So first, if I look back over here, even though there's smudges and things on here, which will add to this, you can see that it is highly polished. These specular highlights are small, and they are not super spread out over the surface like these currently are. So let's go ahead and take our roughness way down. Let's just set it to like 0.01 to start with. Right? So looking at that, that's probably, right, I've probably gone too far. If I go ahead and move this around so I can zoom in a little bit here, and I'm just going to zoom in and get one head a little bit closer in, right? That's making things a little bit too, like, yeah, I need a little bit more roughness than that. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull the roughness up just a touch. And you can see I start to get like a better halo. And so far, so good. We're going to say that that looks pretty good right now. Okay, and then that's all we really need to do here. We're not going to worry about emission color. We'll talk about coat in a little bit, but we're not going to deal with that right now. And so we've got these two things set, right? I would say that this gold is not necessarily super convincing right now. I'm trying to gently zoom in and out. And right, this world is also problematic because we're really only getting, right, that landscape, that dark brown, ground plane in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a landscape primitive to give us a little variation and give us some like texture and things in our reflections. So I'm going to go to landscape. Now, when I do this, everything's going to look really weird in my Redshift window. And that's because it's we're under the landscape right now. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom out a little bit. I'm going to close this material manager and rotate my view some. I'm going to grab the two heads in my object manager, and I'm just going to lift them up until they are on top of this. I'm going to hit S on the keyboard. And I want you to note that, right, already, right, these look a lot more realistic just because they have something other than just the darkness of this earthen plane on there. And I'm going to go ahead and leave my framing here and scale this back over. And I'm not even going to apply a material to the ground plane. It's just going to be a nice flat white surface. You know, he's sort of intersecting it, fantastic. And so, or she, or they, it's really hard to tell with how how these busts are done. So let's see here. So we've got this set. So now we need to add some variation in this surface, right? We'd like to be able to have some of this detail on the surface of this model. So how do I get that? Well, the answer is by using nodes. Now, if you've used a node-based editor previously, this isn't going to be super intense or scary or alien. If you haven't, it may be a little bit alien. And so we're going to talk, we'll talk through it, and we're going to try and keep this simple for this tutorial as we go for, but give you enough information to go forward with. Okay, so when we open the Redshift standard material, there are two nodes that start out. There's this output node, and there's this material node. The output node is basically what is being output. It's what is being drawn to the surface. And you'd be like, well, isn't the material what's being drawn to the surface? It is. However, you can actually mix and blend different materials in Redshift and have them, and then have the result of that output to the surface. And so having this separate output node and this material node gives us a lot of freedom in terms of what we can do. Now, I want you to note a few things that we have going on here. First, if you look through, say, the Redshift material node, and you have it selected, so it's highlighted, right? It's highlighted in yellow right now. You'll see that there's base color, metalness, reflection, roughness, and they all have a dot next to them. And if I look over here, right, these are my different settings, right? And if I go down here, those are available. Notice that some of them are not available. We're going to get into how to access those if needed in a little bit. But they basically have accessible all the settings that are most frequently used to make materials and modify materials. And I want you to look on the output. There's surface, which is the actual where the color from the material goes. There's displacement, volume, environment, and light. And we're not going to talk about anything but maybe displacement in this section of the tutorial. The other ones we're not going to worry about for today. So I also want you to note, if I select a node, then what happens is it switches to whatever, this switches to whatever node I'm on for my material. And so currently we just have two, but we're going to need more. What we're going to need is we're going to want something that maybe, if we look at our preview image, right, maybe we want the roughness. Look, you can see some of these big sweeps here where the highlights are a lot flatter. Maybe we need some scratches and things to appear in our roughness on our reflection, right? And potentially we might want those linked with the metalness value as well on our material, on our color channel or our base channel. But I'm not 100% sure on that. That's something that we might test and see how it works. Now, you're also going to note that there are different colored dots. Yellow is anything dealing with color, right? RGB A, right? So red, green, blue, and alpha. White is anything that deals with what we would call a floating point number, right? And a floating point number is just a decimal number. And so you'll see some of these settings, right, are decimals, whereas if I go to like write my color, my color actually has, and actually this is 8-bit. This doesn't even have, this is just 3-channel. It doesn't have alpha. So, right. So, but it basically, this is like a set of 3 values, right, between 0 and 255. And what's nice is Redshift does do a lot of conversion for us. So there's certain things we can actually connect and have reasonably reliable outputs from. Okay. So let's go ahead and say, well, we need a different node. How do we create a node? How do we move around this window? How do we do anything in here? Well, to move around the window, if I press 1 and click and drag, just like moving the camera around anywhere else, that's the same setting. If I need to zoom in and out, I can click 2 and click and drag to zoom in and out. Orbiting as far as 3, I don't think does anything. It looks like it, yeah, it doesn't do anything. So 2 zooms in and out, 1 is going to move left and right. Okay. You can also do gestures on your touchpad to zoom in and out and move around if you have a Mac. I'm not sure how that works on Windows. And I have a feeling you can probably click the middle mouse button and do the same thing with a mouse. Okay, so we can move around. So how do we create a new node? The easiest way to create a new node is, granted there's create menus and stuff up here, but I never use any of that. I just double click in empty space. And what it does is it actually brings up the asset browser, and then it highlights the nodes. And then within the nodes, there are, right, these are the nodes that are available for Redshift. There's a bunch of other nodes because you can do things in the scene. You can actually create geometry using nodes and do other manipulations and things in the node-based system, which is pretty cool. We're not going to worry about that today. But so you'll see there's all of these different little buckets of nodes. And so if I click on color, you'll see I have a bunch of different options in here. If I click on environment or legacy, which we're not going to worry about, or light, or material, right, or texture, you'll see that there are a bunch there. If I click on utility, there's some here. I want you to note there's a little plus sign next to it. If I pop that open, there's a bunch of other utility options in here. And the same goes for math. Math actually just has one high-level option. And then if I pop this open, there's math to do for color, for floats, and for vectors. And vectors are the purple, right? Vectors are these like the displacement and things like that. And it's just, it doesn't really matter why, but that's what it is. So color, right? We've got some here. We've got our different utilities. And so what we need is we need something to make these scratches. Now there's 2 different ways we can do it, and we're going to start with the procedural way. And we're just going to worry more about smudges. And so what I need to do is I need to click in the search field. And I know where this is now, but it's so much easier. If you need noise, you can type in noise. Right, and so adding noise to something it's a procedural noise generation tool. And so if I go down to Maxon Noise, which the legacy one, we don't want to worry about that. It basically only gives you one noise option. It's pretty limited. But the Maxon Noise is what we want. And we can either click and drag it in here, or you can just double click and it will plop it more or less wherever you had double clicked in your scene or in your window before. Okay, this is a great time to save things. And I want you to note that currently this is black. It's in the process of like generating the preview right now. And so, and noise has a few settings. So I have this selected. I haven't attached this to my color yet at all. And, but I've got these 2 settings. So I've got my colors, I've got a seed value, I've got the type, I've got a number of octaves, and then note that down here there's these flip opens, there's animation. We're not going to be animating anything. I'm going to close that up. We will likely be messing with input, and we might be messing with some of the output settings. So we are going to start by soloing this. And what that means is if I have a material and I want to see just what this node looks like rendered, I can click on this little S here, And what it'll do is it's going to update my model, and it's only going to show that node. So you notice there's no shadows, right? There's nothing on there except this one node. This is really handy when you're trying to debug why something doesn't look right, because you can go in and be like, oh, my noise is like at a too fine a scale for what I'm interested in doing, right? If I was to go ahead and I'm going to undo solo, I'm actually going to go ahead and click on this dot, and I'm going to connect color to my base color for the time being. And I want you to see what happens. So first, right, the color that was the base color disappears, and it's replaced with this takes over. So if I click on my material here, you will see that instead of having this color field like this, it basically shows this little icon and says Maxon Noise, right? And so that means that it has been connected to Maxon Noise. Now, what's nice is I can go in and I can click on this, and there's things you can do. You can replace nodes, blah, 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 whatever, load a texture, etc. You can also, notice there's an arrow here now. If I flip this open, these are all my noise settings, right? It basically allows me access to this node without having to go back and forth and select them. This can be really handy when I'm editing a material here. And that's just something to note. Okay, so I've got this on there. I'm going to go back to soloing this because it's a lot easier to see what's going on. And of course, you know, what's annoying about all of this is that I need to adjust my window significantly so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to go ahead and shrink that down. I don't need any of that stuff. I'm going to pull this over just a touch, and I'm going to go ahead and cover up one head and move this node over a little bit like that. Okay. So let's look at what these settings do. So I'm going to say noise type. If I go, let's do blistered turbulence, it doesn't look very different, right? It's still really small. And that's because by default in Redshift, our overall scale of 1 makes the noise very tiny, which is really nice. It means that we can get, oftentimes noise is really great for adding like really fine like texture or stippling or whatever to a surface. In our case, we want this scale to be larger. I'm going to go ahead and set this to 20. And this way we can kind of see what noise does, right? So you can see that in this case, this blistered turbulence is a blend between these two colors, and it's all kind of, you know, like a crazy, somewhat random shape. I'm going to go ahead and actually I'm going to try and zoom in on this head a little bit. There we go. Okay. All right. So if I change one of these colors, right, if I go from black to say red, right, it's going to update and it will change the color of this noise, right? And I can change the white color to something else as well. Obviously, this isn't necessarily what I want to do for this material, but right, you get the idea. So I'm going to undo that so I get my black and white back. And octaves is another thing. If I reduce the number of octaves, you'll see that basically it looks like it's being blurred, right? It just means the octaves are like how much detail is there. And you'll see you can crank up to a certain point, and unless you're zoomed way in or the noise is scaled very large, you're not going to really notice a difference. The default for each setting is usually a pretty good place to start. We're not going to worry about the input source for the thing. We're going to leave it at the default, which is the object. If I want this noise to stretch in a particular dimension, like let's say vertically, I can say, let's make this 10, right? And I'm going to start getting smearing. I want you to note that it's smearing here, but it's not smearing here. And this is a problem that we're going to solve with a triplanar thing in a more advanced tutorial. Right, so I can get noise to essentially smear in one direction by changing right, the scale, if needed. We're not going to be too worried about doing any of that for this tutorial. I just want to show you that's an option. Some other settings that we've got available to us down here in the output section is cycles. If I crank the cycles up, you can see that that makes a pretty substantial change, right? It basically, it's almost like a feedback filter, right? Where it applies feedback to this and it just kind of layers it and layers it and layers it and layers it based on how many cycles we have. So I'm going to set this back to 1 for the time being. We don't need anything that intense. And then low clip and high clip. The best way to know what these do is just to play. If I drag the low clip up, what that does is it's basically going to increase the strength of the darker area, whichever one is color 1, right? And if I pull that down and I bring my high clip down, right, it's going to reduce the intensity, it's going to increase the intensity of the white areas and hide some of the darker sections. And then brightness and contrast, right, if I boost brightness, it's just going to make it all, right, a lot softer. And if I boost contrast, if you've ever done anything, right, you know, it's going to be more contrasty until it's just two-tone in the end, which isn't really what we want either in this case. Although we might just start with this so we can really see what we're doing to the object when we actually make a change. Okay, so I've got my contrast blasted to 1. High clip I should just set to 1. So that it's as blasted as it can be. It's so gorgeous right now, right? If you go through different types of noise, you can see there's all sorts of different things, and granted, they're not going to look super great right now, right? But there's there's different ways that these noise types show up. That's actually kind of amazing when I've last did it this much. But there's things like mod noise. Yeah, and if I was to actually have this at a sane value of, say, 0, right, you can see it's actually like a grayscale grid. But I'm going to go back to the blistered turbulence and set this back to 1, just so it's very clear what's happening. And, right, we don't actually want this attached to the color channel. We want this to be attached to our reflection roughness. So I'm going to go ahead and select the wire between these nodes. And if I just select that and hit delete, it'll disconnect it. And I can go ahead and come down here and I can drop this into my roughness. And you're going to see that, right, it's made a very strong change already here. Now, if I go back to my main view, nothing's changed, right? And that's because I'm still soloing the noise. So I'm going to turn that off. And now you can kind of see what this has done to our image, right? So the areas that are, let's solo this again. The areas that are black are perfectly reflective. The areas that are white are totally flat colored, right? You can already see that this could make some really interesting materials. So let's make some refinements on this because this is pretty intense. So we're going to select our noise. And let's set our contrast back to 0. Right? Okay, so now we've got something that's a little bit better, but this is still like way too intense. Right? And specifically, right, we actually want more black, we want more reflection, and we want less rough areas. So if I was to pull my low clip up, right, this in one way is one way that I can get, right, those areas to be reduced. Now, the only issue is that I still have that full tonal range, right? I still have from black to white. It's just like significantly more black than it is white. What I'd really like is to have less of a range between these two. And so I'm going to go ahead and actually the best place to usually start in making adjustments is up here with your colors, right? Because if this color is much closer to black, then you'll notice that it creates a much more subtle effect, right? If I just click down here a few times, right? You can see that as I go, now I'm starting to get something that looks passable, right? You can see that my highlights are being smeared a little bit. It kind of looks cloudy still, but it's, right? But I'm getting something that's much nicer where I barely have any motion. And if I go back and look at my source, you can see, right, in some of this area, you can see where I'm getting some smearing, and it's still like a little bit too intense. And I think the scale is probably too big for the noise as well. So I'm going to, before I make any further changes to make it more subtle, I'm going to go ahead and set my overall scale to 10. Okay, so you can see that that's tightened up those a little bit. I might go down to 5. Now, the only issue with getting smaller in scale here, right, is that I'm getting more of these points. So I'm going to say I'm going to go back up to 10. And then I'm going to go ahead and continue to drop this color down until it's, and right, it's getting so close down here, it's kind of hard to do. But if I go over to my vibrance slider, I should be able to crank my vibrance slider down. And just as a reminder, it's amazing that we can have essentially real-time updates of this as I'm moving the slider. Okay. Now, I want you to note that the other problem here is that actually these highlights are getting too small and too dim. And so if you remember, right, having something that was perfectly, that had basically no roughness at all was problematic because it made these highlights too small. So what I should do is I should actually, let's say we increase this, my vibrance to 13 for this color. And then let's go to our black and let's increase this vibrance as well. Right, and so you can see I'm starting to get, and I've got this set to 5. So now I'm starting to get something that has a stronger base roughness, right? It's got a stronger reflectance. However, it's not getting totally blasted out either, right? And so you can see I've got these two colors pretty close together. And let's go ahead and see if we can make a couple more refinements. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click back here, click over here. I'm going to try and zoom in on this head just a little bit more. And to somewhere where there is, maybe we'll go on the chest real quick. Okay. Right, so you can see that, right, this is still looking pretty cloudy, and that's in part because our octaves are set as high as they are. Let's set this octave to 2 and see what happens. Right, so that softens a lot of that noise out. We can go ahead and set this down to 1. Let's set it to 1. Right, so that makes it smeary. I don't know if that's exactly what we want. Let's go back to 2. Because that does give us a fair amount of smudginess. Right? It's not perfect, but it's doing a pretty good job. Now, the other thing we could change at this point is we could say, well, do I want to adjust one of these low clips or high clips? We definitely don't want to boost our number of cycles up, right? If I crank this up, right, we're going to get much harder edges and you're going to see this. But if I crank my cycles down a little bit, let's see what happens if it looks like if you go below 1, it doesn't make any change whatsoever. So, so then now we could either, we could experiment with decreasing our contrast. We could experiment with low clip and high clip. If I boost my low clip up, let's see what happens. Right, that's actually making these areas harder. Let's see what happens if I pull my high clip down a little bit. Right, if I pull it down, it's really like eventually, you know, not really doing what we want there either. We could adjust our brightness a touch and see if that softens those clouds up or decrease our contrast. Let's go ahead and see what happens if we decrease our contrast. I think if we decrease the contrast just a touch, I don't think we need to change our brightness and set that to 0. We might even want to decrease the brightness a little bit, right? But so we're just doing this to do these subtle changes. Now, this might not be absolutely perfect with our model, but this is something where, right, we can continue to tweak for a long time. And so I don't want this tutorial to go on forever. I can sit here and go back and forth for a really long time. I'm going to rotate my view a little bit here just so we can see the front view. Okay, so as I move this around, you can see that it really looks like there's some smudginess and imperfection on the surface of this object. Now you'll note that, right, I'm still getting a lot of kind of strange reflections here, and that's in part because of my scene. But I've already started to get like a really nice result